Today on Blue 58, the Packers linebackers are somewhat new, hopefully improved, and definitely playing in a new scheme. How does all of that add up in 2024?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, happy to be with you here for another episode. And I don't want to overpromise, but hopefully this is going to be a quick series of episodes. Today is the 18th of July, and if things go according to plan, to get us caught up for my time off and get us through these positional previews before we get to training camp, which starts on Monday. Technically, it starts on Monday. The actual stuff of it starts Tuesday. But to get us through positional previews before we get to that point, we are hopefully, and I don't want to overpromise here, if things go according to plan here, hopefully going to be dropping episodes Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, or Monday, depending when I want to release that last one. Probably Sunday, we'll see. But hopefully this is going to be a stream of content here because I want to make sure that we are getting to everybody that we want to talk about before training camp starts and before this season is off and running. Because, ladies and gentlemen, your 2024 Green Bay Packers are coming. There's also a chance that as we record this, we're about to get news about Jordan Love's contract extension. So let's do the pre-news on that. It's good. That's about it. That's about all I got. It's good that the Packers will sign Jordan Love to an extension because having a quarterback is better than not having a quarterback, and that's what the Packers will have if and when they sign him to this extension. I've seen just a couple of pieces from people that are like, Jordan Love reporting to camp without a contract extension. What's going on here? It's going to get done. It's going to happen. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. It's going to happen probably within the next 24 to 48 hours on the long end, I would bet. Anyhow, linebackers, not quarterbacks, is what we're going to be talking about today. And I feel like linebackers are really hard to evaluate and kind of along those lines, therefore really hard to set levels of expectations for a few reasons. First, I feel like linebackers are uniquely reactive. It's a uniquely reactive position. They're close to the action, so unlike cornerbacks and safeties, which are also reacting to what they see in front of them, they are getting it in their face very quickly. They either have to be back in coverage or taking care of their run responsibilities really quickly because they are so close to the line of scrimmage. And most of defense, with the possible exception of some of the defensive line's requirements, is reactive, but I feel like among all the defensive positions, linebackers have it the toughest. They're also uniquely dependent on the people around them, the other positions on defense. Look at a stereotypical Tampa 2 defense. If you can picture the play diagram in your head, picture it like you're calling this play in Madden, as though you are on the offensive side facing the defense. Typically you have, let's just say 4 down linemen here. Let's do it ultra traditional. You have 3 linebackers behind them, then 2 safeties and 2 cornerbacks. Your defensive linemen are going forward. They're going into the offensive backfield, hopefully. Your 2 corners on the outside have the flats to either side. Your 2 safeties deep behind them are going deep. They have the 2. That is the 2 in the Tampa 2. They're the 2 deep. And then your linebackers all have to kind of fan out and play zones, especially the middle linebacker, who's got to cover the zone in the short middle, but also kind of the hole between the 2 safeties. In that situation, your middle linebacker in particular is in a position where he's got to count on the defensive lineman ahead of him to soak up blocks if he's going to make a play in the run game. He's got to count on the safeties behind him for help over the top, because even though his responsibility is to get depth, to get down the field, to cover that middle, if one of those safeties is out of position, he's going to have to get so deep that it really isn't going to matter. Anybody going up the seam is going to be open pretty much no matter what the linebacker does, because you can just bloop it over his head and there's nobody behind him to make the quarterback respect any of the deep coverage. So if the safety's messed up, then the linebackers end up in a tough situation and an untenable situation as well. And then the middle linebacker, but also the other linebackers, again, are reliant on people to the right and left of them too, because people coming in and out of those zones are being handed off from other guys, and if they're not doing their job or they misread that handoff, suddenly it looks like the linebacker is held out to dry or hung out to dry. So they're dependent very much on not just doing their jobs themselves, but also other people stepping up to do their jobs. And then, out of all of the stats that we have on football, most of the ones that you would use to track linebackers really don't exist. They're just not there. And the ones we do have really aren't great. So think about this. Linebackers' jobs, and really all defenders' jobs, but linebackers in particular, since that's what we're talking about in this episode, their job is to stop things from happening. How do you measure the non-existence of something? How do you measure someone deciding not to do something? Returning to the example about playing coverage on defense, a lot of coverage metrics are based on the quarterback throwing the ball in your direction. Passer rating when targeted, all your traditional counting stats, passes defense, interceptions, even tackles related to coverage and stuff like that. All that is predicated on the quarterback throwing the ball in your direction. And it's good if you're making plays in those situations, but ideally you're doing your job so well that the quarterback doesn't even throw at you, right? So if you're a linebacker and in that Tampa 2, you're the middle linebacker dropping down the middle of the field, say you're carrying a tight end up the seam, and you do such a good job in coverage that the quarterback sees what he thinks is going to be an opening, since he knows where the weak spots are in that cover 2, Tampa 2 defense. He knows what to look for. You do a good job covering him. He decides to go somewhere else. He throws the ball to the outside. He checks the ball down to the running back or whatever. He doesn't throw at you because you've done your job. How do you quantify that statistically? There's really not a way that I know of to get at that from a statistical perspective. And then the numbers we do have, I think, are woefully flawed. Guys can pile up bunches of tackles just by being on the field a whole bunch. Blake Martinez regularly was at or near the leaderboards in season, in the season-long tackle metrics in the NFL, and that was good. But we had the consistent conversation when he was in Green Bay about depth of tackle. Where on the field is he making those tackles? And if you look at some of the advanced numbers, it was further downfield. And you dig into the counting stats for linebackers or whoever on defense, you start to come up with these sort of caveats all the time. The traditional metrics are not always that good at pointing out who's actually a good player on defense. You can look at something like ball hawks like we do, the plays on the ball, and that's good too. Forced fumbles are good. Sacks are obviously good. Passes defensed are good. Interceptions are good. But again, it's not a perfect thing, because a big part of a linebacker's job is to stop things from happening at all. All that to say, take my thoughts on linebackers with a bit of a grain of salt, maybe 2. I do have some thoughts about linebackers, though, salted or unsalted. Looking at the Packers linebackers heading into 2024, you've got a group in a very interesting spot. Since the 2022 offseason, the Packers have been doing something I think that is historically unusual for them, at least in the 21st century. They've been throwing a lot of resources at the linebacker position. Since the 2022 offseason, right in the same week as the Packers traded Davante Adams and re-signed Aaron Rodgers, they also re-signed Devondre Campbell to a big free agent deal. They've also spent a first-round pick and a second-round pick and a third-round pick on a linebacker in that same time span. Some of those moves have worked out. Some of them haven't. But they're spending the resources there. Is that a good idea? I'm not sure. On the one hand, you've got the ongoing discussion about positional value. Is linebacker a position where you want to be spending a bunch of resources on? I don't know. Relative to your other defensive positions, it seems like there are others that are more valuable. Cornerback is probably more valuable. Edge rusher is certainly more valuable. A great interior defensive lineman is probably more valuable. A safety is probably more valuable too, though I think you could have that discussion with kind of the hybridization between linebackers and safeties that's going on in the NFL, especially as safeties play more and more in the slot and drop down to play in the box and stuff like that. But they're not at the top end of positional value. I don't think that's really a debatable point. On the other hand, what's the draft philosophy we talked about this spring? Get good players. Is linebacker the most valuable position on defense? No. But is having a good linebacker better than having a bad linebacker? Absolutely yes. Given the choice, no one would choose to have subpar linebackers when they could have good linebackers. No one would do that. You would want to have the good players if you can get them. So, it really just comes down to, from that perspective, getting the good players, and it doesn't really matter where you get them. And on top of that, the hit rate is so low in the draft anyway that you might as well just spend the picks. If you think a guy is going to be good, you trust your evaluations, and maybe don't worry so much about positional value and evaluation. Does it really matter? Does it really matter where you get them as long as you're getting good players consistently at every position? I think there's a case to be made that no, it doesn't really matter that much. So here's something I am sure about. This group has a big pile of unknowns heading into this season. Top of the depth chart down. Quay Walker has had a bit of a roller coaster in his first 2 years. What is he in year 3? Edgerrin Cooper and Tyron Hopper. They're rookies, so who really knows about them at all? Isaiah McDuffy, maybe he is the most known commodity in that linebacker room right now. What does that add up to? And then you've got a bunch of fairly limited, but I think useful guys beyond that. Eric Wilson, we'll talk about here in a second. Christian Welch, good in his own way. There are useful players on this roster beyond the top end. And then on top of that, you've got a scheme change. So what is this defense even going to look like? Who's going to be on the field? How often are they in base? How often are they on single linebacker sets? Are they ever? Do they ever take all of their linebackers on their off the field? Are their top 3 linebackers always on the field together? Would they ever play 4 linebackers at once? We don't really know. There's a lot we don't know. It's a pretty unknown position heading into 2024. So let's try to push back on that darkness a little bit. First, again, a reminder about our Patreon and Substack subscriptions. Really want to talk about Substack here for a second, not even the paid version. We are trying to bring back our Packers polling in 2024. That's a feature that we discontinued last year because we used to do that polling through Twitter. Twitter has just gotten to the point where it's no longer worth the effort to try to do that there. Basically, site usability issues, and it's more time-consuming to do stuff via Twitter poll-wise than some other sources. So we're trying to do Packers polling via Substack this year. They've got a pretty substantial substantive polling feature within their newsletters there. So if you would sign up even just for a free subscription at Substack, just go to thepowersweep.substack.com. You'll get a weekly email when it's time for polls, as well as notifications of the other articles that we write at thepowersweep.com. I've also been sharing those through Substack. We're looking to get 100 subscriptions. We've got about 40 right now. We're looking to get to 100. If we could get to 100 or more, and I would feel pretty good about the polling for this year. So if we can get to that level, we're going to bring back polling this year, and I hope that we can. So go to thepowersweep.substack.com to sign up for free, not even a low price, the lowest price you can imagine of free. I would pay you to do it, but I do not have the funds to do that. So just at least check out the free version there and get involved with our polling efforts for 2024. So linebackers, only 2 guys in the no expectations group. We're just going to skip over these guys for this episode. There's really nothing to talk about in depth with either Raylan Goforth or Christian Young. We've mentioned their names in undrafted free agent recaps and stuff like that, but there's enough guys at other levels of the roster that I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about Goforth and Young. I do not expect either of them to make a serious push for the roster if they end up on the practice squad. I mean, there's 16 available spots there now, so it wouldn't be completely impossible, but I'd rather spend the bulk of our time today on the guys for whom we actually have some expectations this year. So that starts us off with Christian Welch, who was a special teams only player in 2023. 210 snaps on special teams, not inconsiderable in terms of playing time. Nice story, too, out of Iola, Wisconsin. But low expectations because even though the Packers did re-sign him after his performance last year, the roster has changed a lot around him. There's really no 2 ways about that. The Packers drafted 2 guys at the position, 2nd and 3rd round pick, in Edgerrin Cooper and Tyron Hopper. It's a different sort of roster heading into 2024 for Welch, so accordingly, I think low expectations for him. So really, he just has to figure out a way to stick around this year. And it's going to be tough for the special teams specific guys because I think about a third of special teams is going to essentially get wiped out this year. I am not optimistic that the kickoff rule is going to really work, I guess, not to put too fine a point on it, but I don't think this is really going to be a situation where things work out how they believe it's going to. I think we're going to have very few actual kickoff returns, and I think along those lines, you're going to have a very small need for special teamers. So that's tough sledding for guys like Welch, who are getting pushed down the depth chart, who were not super high up in the depth chart to begin with, and now they don't have as many opportunities to be out there on the field. So I think Welch, prediction-wise, is going to be done in Green Bay this year. Certainly no better than the practice squad to start out. Tyron Hopper is next up, and I'm putting him in the low expectations camp for a couple reasons. Well, we'll talk about it here in a second, but first, set the table on what Hopper is as a player. A little bit of a curiosity as a draft pick. Not great size, good but not great athleticism, and the counting stats, with one exception, were not great for Hopper at Missouri. But, well, I guess two exceptions here. One, here's a counting stat for you. 500-plus special team snaps at Missouri. So watch out, Christian Welch. So big-time college special teams player. But secondly, he had some notable productivity as a pass rusher. 8.5 career sacks in college. Said to be an elite blitzer. Bill Huber of Packers Central wrote about him earlier this offseason. He interviewed Hopper's college position coach, DJ Smith, who is himself a former Packers linebacker. And Smith had some very complimentary things to say about Hopper. Quote, just his overall development as a player. You want to talk about his movement skills in the box and his man-to-man things, the things he can do from a blitzing standpoint. I think he's the best one-on-one pass rusher in the draft, in my personal opinion, just from the standpoint of being able to rush off the edge, rush as an off-the-ball linebacker. He just has it, man. He's slippery in there. He's slippery, end quote. So Huber follows up. Best pass rusher among linebackers? No. Smith thought he was the best pass rusher, period. Quote, I'm talking in general. When you're talking about sending somebody and getting home, he can do it, in my opinion, and I could be biased, end quote. Huber continues, the coach-to-player bias is understandable. However, according to Pro Football Focus, Hopper ranked 6th in the nation among all off-ball linebackers with 32 pressures in 2022. Just Google Tyron Hopper, Bill Huber, and you will get to the rest of the article there. But it's a good exploration of his skill set. His numbers did drop off a little bit in 2023, but Smith says they used him a little bit differently, and he suspects he would have gotten more pre-draft attention had they used him more in 2023 like they did in 2022. Clearly, they saw him as a guy with a specific skill set, one that they could use in a specific way, and they used him in that way 2 seasons ago, but not last season, because they had different needs on their defense. That puts him in a little bit of an odd spot here coming into 2024 with the Packers, because the Packers, and Brian Gutekunst said he had a second-round grade on him, the Packers are in the process of revamping their linebacker room. Gone is Devondre Campbell. In a new role is Quay Walker. Then you've got Edgerrin Cooper and Hopper playing alongside Isaiah McDuffy, who became kind of a core part of the Packers defense down the stretch. I think that adds up, for me at least, to low expectations for Hopper. Not that he's not interesting, but he just comes across so much as a wait-and-see sort of player. We got to see what he is, how they want to use him. What do they want him to do? Is he going to play just special teams? That's probably a good fit for him. He seems to have a great build for that kind of work. Is he going to get any snaps on defense? Is he going to take snaps away from Isaiah McDuffy? We don't know. So I think these sort of expectations are more about tempering expectations than not having them at all for Hopper. I just don't know where we should set the level for him, so I'm defaulting more to the lower end. He meets expectations then by first filling the obvious role to start and then growing from there. I think if you look at his profile, you look at what he does athletically, you look at where he is as a player, he starts out as a special teams kind of guy. He looks like that sort of player, and so he's just got to fill that role from the get-go. He's got to be on the field, playing special teams, doing special teams kind of stuff, and then we'll see what he grows into from that point. That seems like an easy way for him to meet expectations in 2024, and I think that's something that he can do. So I think prediction-wise, he's going to play 250 or more special team snaps this year. They drafted him to use them, and I think he's going to siphon off snaps from a guy like Christian Welch and maybe even from Eric Wilson, who we'll talk about up next. Oh, there he is, Eric Wilson, on the podcast notes outline here. Eric Wilson, the very definition of a core special teams player since he arrived in Green Bay. 197 snaps on special teams in 13 games in 2022. 308 in 2023, not including playoffs. And in the playoffs, he had a spectacular fumble recovery on Keyshawn Nixon's longest kickoff return of the season. What a roller coaster of emotions that particular play was. The Packers hanging with and even leading the 49ers at that point. Nixon busts a kickoff return that looks for a second like it could go all the way. What a thrilling moment that would have been. Nixon so close all year long, finally rips one off for a score in the playoffs and potentially powering the Packers to the NFC Championship game. But then out of nowhere, gets hit from the side. He fumbles. It looks like it's all going up in smoke. And then out of nowhere comes Eric Wilson scooping up the ball with a spectacular dive, keeping the Packers' hopes against the 49ers alive. How often are you talking about a special teams player who doesn't have the ball at the start of the play making a play that you actually remember, 7 months later now? That's quite a play for Eric Wilson. On top of that, he's been a non-zero performer on defense. He doesn't play a lot on defense, but when he's out there, he doesn't make the defense actively worse, which I think is a bigger thing than you might initially think. And we'll talk about that more here in a second with Isaiah McDuffy. But Wilson has a pretty long track record of playing significant defensive snaps dating back to the early portions of his career. Didn't get on the field as a rookie, but he played 300-plus snaps on defense for the Vikings in 2018 and 2019, and then more than 1,000 snaps on defense in 2020. He's been out there a lot on defense historically, not necessarily in Green Bay, but he can do it and has. But low expectations, I think, for Wilson. More about his role than about his ability, because he does his job well. It's just that he's got a very specific job, so he's just got to keep doing that job. I predict that he's going to be top 3 in special team snaps for the Packers again this year, and top 2 in special teams tackles. He's going to be right up there. He does what Eric Wilson has always done, and I think he has always done, and I think he'll do it again this year. So that brings us to our moderate expectations group, and we start here with Isaiah McDuffy. And this is not really about Isaiah McDuffy in the short term, but we'll get there. I want to talk about a new definition or a new term that I want to introduce to our lexicon for a specific kind of player. I want to introduce you to the snap eater. The snap eater is a guy who plays a significant amount of snaps. He's just out there eating up playing time for you. And that may sound like a negative at the start, but it's not. This is the specific sort of player who's playing a ton of snaps, who is the sort of solid, reliable player who's not your big playmaker, but he's not making things worse for your defense. This is kind of what I was getting to with Eric Wilson a little bit earlier. Occasionally, and often significantly, you need a guy who's just going to be out there not messing things up for you. This is where a lot of your non-premium offensive linemen can make a living. They may not be a premier tackle or guard or center, but they can be out there and play significant snaps for you, and they're not going to be someone you have to game plan around because they're a negative. Isaiah McDuffy was that sort of player in 2023, and I think that kind of guy is insanely valuable. Not everybody is going to be a star, but guys like McDuffy are very helpful to the guys that are. In an ideal world, you would have a guy like Isaiah McDuffy who's doing the grunt work, play in and play out, just freeing up a lot of responsibilities or stuff for your other linebacker to do, so he can do what he is better at. For a while in the Mike Pettin era, you had guys who filled this role, I think, in a remarkable sort of way. It was never like a headline sort of position, but you had guys like Alonzo Harris. Alonzo Morrison. Alonzo Harris was the running back. Alonzo Morrison and B.J. Goodson, who were the sidekick linebacker for Blake Martinez. They were out there to soak up snaps and primarily to play run defense because they were both bigger-bodied guys than Martinez was. But they would be out there, and they would be the guys that would do a lot of the grunt work stuff. They'd be taking on the guards. They'd be filling gaps hard, and then Martinez comes and cleans up after them, doing the other responsibilities for a linebacker. That is the snap eater sort of player. And McDuffy is that kind of guy who sets the table for others out there. He's the guy who's going to fly around and do all the dirty work, be a nuisance sometimes to the opposing offense, who's never going to be one of your primary playmakers, but he's out there setting up other people to do what they do best. And he played a key role for the Packers too last year. Played a lot of snaps on defense, more than 500. He had 7 games with more than 40 snaps last year, 2 more with 37 or more. So he's on the field a lot. And not a splashy player, again, but full effort all the time. And that is a great sort of player to have on your roster. And a great value for the Packers, actually, what they got in the draft for McDuffie, too. Drafted him in the 7th round, essentially to replace Ty Summers. And he's done that and more. He's been more of a player on defense than Summers ever was. And now he's heading into his 4th year with a chance to, again, have a significant role on this defense. But I think fairly moderate expectations overall. I don't think it's clear yet how things are going to shake out ahead of him on the depth chart or what role he has exactly. There's a big unknown to that with all these off-the-ball guys. We don't know how playing time is going to shake out or what responsibilities they're going to have when they're on the field, because we just need to see it first. We need to see a lot of what they're doing and how it looks different from what we've seen from the defense in the relatively recent past. So a big unknown for McDuffie and the rest of the linebacker room as well. And where does he stack up against guys like Edgerrin Cooper and Tyron Hopper, and where do the Packers want them to stack up too? Because it could be the sort of situation like we saw with Rudy Ford last year. I think Ford was a better player than Anthony Johnson, start to finish last year. There was no reason, all things being equal, that you would want Johnson playing ahead of Ford, except all things weren't equal. They wanted to get an idea what Ford could bring them, what Johnson could bring them longer term. So about midseason, Ford just basically went away on defense. No more Rudy Ford on defense for the Packers. And they said, we're going with Anthony Johnson. And they got a look at him, and they decided some other things about Anthony Johnson as a result of that. But they knew Ford was a long-term answer there. And so they played the guy who they thought might be. Contract-wise, McDuffie might not be a long-term answer for the Packers either. So how does that factor into playing time? Because it will. It just does. That's one of those things that does happen. And it's going to happen. And whether or not it happens to McDuffie, we'll see. I think his snaps are going to drop a little bit from 2023. I think he will be far enough ahead of a guy like Tyron Hopper that he still plays more than 400 on defense. I also think he's going to break 200 snaps on special teams again, so a core special teamer and a key depth piece on defense. That brings us to Edgerrin Cooper, who I went back and forth on, but I think he's going to end up being in my moderate expectations group rather than the high expectations group for some reasons that I want to outline here. First, super interesting pick. Brian Gutekunst's definitely doubling down on his linebacker efforts, as we mentioned up top in this podcast. Again, Devondre Campbell re-signed in 2022. The same year, you draft Quay Walker in the first round. Devondre Campbell sort of fades away. Now here comes Edgerrin Cooper. Clearly there is a vision there, roster building wise. They want to put resources at linebacker. How does he fit in with that vision, though? I'm not sure. And I don't know if anybody knows for sure, but we do know that the short-term praise has been pretty noteworthy from the Packers. In particular, Matt LaFleur says he's doing well, and Quay Walker says he's doing well. That seems like a pretty good start. Your head coach is specifically calling out how good you look in the early going here, and your primary running mate at linebacker says you're off to a good start. That seems pretty good to me. But moderate expectations for a few reasons. First, he is a rookie. We don't know how he's going to adapt to the NFL. Some rookies hit the ground running, others don't. All the offseason praise is well and good. Doesn't count for much because it's not real football. We also don't know exactly where he falls on the depth chart right now. Are they going to bring him along slowly, or are they going to put him out there next to Quay Walker right away? For sure, he's behind Quay Walker, at least for right now, and I think between that and the other stuff related to the depth chart, there is a little bit of a ceiling on what he could do this year. Now, there is a world where he just outplays Quay Walker from the get-go, and suddenly you have 1 and 1A linebackers in Green Bay, which would be a great problem to have. I don't think that's super likely just because of the learning curve. And then, of course, there's the scheme stuff because, again, we don't know exactly what to look for. And I feel like I'm saying I don't know a lot when it comes to linebackers this year, but I think there's a lot that we don't know. So how does he meet expectations? A few things we do know about Edgerrin Cooper. He's a very fast player. He's a very special, flashy player at times at Texas A&M too. And he has the skill set to play a small, specialized role that can make a lot of maybe not splashy plays, but exciting plays. Put it that way. He strikes me a little bit like a summer blockbuster sort of movie. Not necessarily that he's going to be all explosions and CGI, but just that when you go into a certain kind of movie, you sit down here in late July for a movie that on the poster might have, I don't know, some kind of alien invasion or a giant robot or a dinosaur or a combination of all those things, a giant robot fighting a dinosaur that's a part of an alien invasion, I don't know. All things lead back to Pacific Rim for me sooner or later. But that's when you sit down for a movie like that, you know exactly what you're expecting. You're expecting big explosions. You're expecting maybe a thin plot. It's not something you're going to have to think about a whole lot. Just meet those expectations. So I think that's kind of what I'm looking for Edgerrin Cooper here. I don't need him to be the 1,200 snap linebacker who's just on the field every play. I don't need him to be even the rock solid sidekick type linebacker. I think you're looking for him to fill the role kind of that Quay Walker was supposed to fill next to Devondre Campbell while Quay Walker is still on the field with him. So basically just juicing up the linebacker core a little bit, adding more speed, adding more playmaking ability, and just being out there in a way that kind of fits with those early scouting reports on him. The fast, instinctual, athletic sort of linebacker. Maybe he is not super nuanced yet as a rookie, but he's out there, and he's making splash plays from time to time. And splash plays may be a little bit different for a rookie than everybody else, but just coming along and adding some juice to that linebacker position than we've seen recently. And I think I'm kind of trying to say this without saying it, that because I think I've fallen back on this a lot for player evaluations this summer, but it is kind of a vibes thing with Cooper. With all the things that we don't know about linebackers, they seem to be doubled with a rookie linebacker who's very similar to expectation-wise to the guy who came before him in Quay Walker. What does that look like in terms of putting a hard prediction on it? I don't really know. It's kind of like just vibes. Do you feel good when Edgerrin Cooper's out there on defense for the Packers? I think he's going to end up playing a pretty big role. I don't think he's going to end up being slowed down by Isaiah McDuffie. I certainly don't think he's going to get slowed down by Tyron Hopper. I think Cooper plays 600-plus snaps on defense this year and has 10 or more ball hawks. Pretty lofty, maybe predictions for a second-round pick, but I think he can beat them, and I think he's going to get the opportunity to beat them. So I guess, look, on the fly here, let's move him into high expectations. I've talked myself into it. Maybe there are some things that we just don't know about him, but I think, he has a high enough ceiling that we can say that we have high expectations for him, because even this is a good example of something we've talked about on the show before. High expectations can mean different things for different players. And there's probably no better example of that than maybe Cooper and Quay Walker, who's our next up guy. Walker was a first-round pick surprise a couple years back. And since then, I think we can fairly talk about him as a bit of a boom or bust player. When it's good, Quay Walker is one of the best linebackers I think the Packers have had in the 21st century. At his best, he makes plays that no one else or few others have made at the position since 2000 or 2001, depending how you measure your centuries. Are you into ordinal numbers for your time counting, or when you see it switch from 19 to 20, does that do it for you? I don't know. Anyhow, a bit of a boomer bust player. At his very best, he's one of the best we've seen. At his worst, it looks like he shouldn't be out there, like he's getting lost, and some of that was probably the scheme of Jeff Hafley's predecessor. But just as a quick for instance here, in 2023, he had 3 games with a Pro Football Focus grade above 70, which is a quality starter or better. He had 1 game, week 1 of last year, with a PFF grade above 90. It's really good. That's probably obvious, but it is. He also had 4 games with a PFF grade of 46 or worse. That's the he shouldn't be on the field type stuff. But he did play a lot, counting playoffs nearly 1,000 snaps, including some missed time in there, so he was on the field a lot. But he didn't make a ton of plays last year either. He had 11.5 ball hawks in 2022, great for a rookie. But he was down to 6.5 in 2023. And we did hear a little bit of Devondre Campbell talking about how they wanted things to be a little bit different from the linebackers, so maybe there's a reason for that. All in all, though, a little bit of a mixed bag for Walker, but I can't give up on him even if it hasn't been consistently outstanding or even consistently what you'd hope for from a former first-round pick. And to be clear, I think he's been good a lot. It's just that there's been a fair number of bad things to go with it. But this year could be very different for him. The scheme is different. His role should be different. People have talked about that in a variety of different ways. And the players around him are different too. How does he play alongside Edgerrin Cooper or maybe Isaiah McDuffy in a bigger role, or even Tyron Hopper versus Devondre Campbell, who, even if he may still have it mentally, I don't think there's any reason to think that McDuffy or Cooper or Hopper isn't a better physical player than Campbell was last year in 2024. He was, even if it wasn't his fault, and I'm not blaming him for his injuries or trying to get out there, all the credit in the world for him if he was trying to play through injuries like he says he was, but he was still dinged up last year. None of those guys are, and they should be in much better position to at least be at their physical best in 2024 where Campbell wasn't. How does that affect a guy like Quay Walker? Ideally, it frees him up to be more of the playmaker the Packers have wanted him to be, but we don't know. So things could be different, and I would argue that things have to be different because next offseason the Packers have to make a decision on his 5th-year option, which should be fairly expensive. And based on what we've seen so far through 2 seasons, it would probably be a no from me. Not that you don't want Walker around long-term, but I'm not looking, based on his first 2 seasons here, to give him a fully guaranteed 5th year at this point. A lot of stuff's going to change in a year, though, so that doesn't necessarily mean all that much. But I think it's fairly obvious that we have high expectations for Walker this year for different reasons than Cooper. Cooper is an exciting player that's full of potential. Walker is a uniquely talented player who has not lived up to his potential. He, I think a little bit like Christian Watson, has the ongoing curse of greatness. He has physical abilities that no other linebacker in Green Bay has right now, and no other linebacker has had in Green Bay in a long time. And fair or not, the standards are therefore different for a guy like Walker or Christian Watson than they would be for somebody else, for an Isaiah McDuffy. Walker is 6'4", 240-something pounds. He looks like Quay Walker, statuesque. Isaiah McDuffy is 6'1" and 227 pounds. He is not Quay Walker-esque. He is not statuesque in the way that a Quay Walker is. The expectations, again, fair or not, are just different for guys like that. So he meets those expectations by looking and playing like the playmaker the Packers have hoped for him to be, and he has to do it consistently. Consistency and making those plays have been the 2 big problems for Walker to this point in his career. In a new scheme, does he do it? I think the answer is yes. Maybe this is just hopium, put it that way. I don't know. But I think a couple things are true. First, Walker still has great physical abilities. And second, I think Jeff Hafley is going to be much better positioned, almost by default, at putting his players in a position to do what they do well. There were some things that Joe Barry did do well in his time with the Packers. There are reasons for this that we don't have to go into, but his pass defenses statistically stacked up with some of the best in the NFL. And he did put together a good defense in 2021. And he did consistently when the Packers, when his back was to the wall, he got good defensive performances out of the Packers in must-win games. Overall, situationally, look at the end of the 49ers game, look at the end of the Packers-Lions game at the end of 2022. There are some gripes there, but still very winnable games for the Packers because of Barry's defense. And yet, the consistent number one complaint, I think, year over year on Barry was that he just did not seem to recognize the individual abilities that his players had and put those players in a position to utilize those abilities, to the point that almost anyone would have to be better at it by default. So I think Hafley is going to be able to get more out of guys just because he probably won't be quite so bad at that one key thing. So I think that benefits Walker in a really, really big way. I think along those lines, then, he's going to lead the Packers in tackles. He's going to finish the season top 3 in defensive snaps played. He's going to have a career high in ball hog, so more than 11.5. And I think we're going to come out of this season feeling like Walker is in a position where we can believe in him long term. I just think that's going to be the impact of a guy like Hafley, who seems to have a better understanding based on what everyone has said about him at every one of his coaching stops on how to get the most out of guys who have unique individual skills. And that, I think, is really a huge difference, one that seems like not even seems like, is a very soft skill sort of thing. It's not a scheme issue. It's not drawing up plays. It's just it's basically people skills. And you listen to Joe Barry, you talk to Joe Barry. I've never talked to him, but you see the beat writers talk to him. You hear his press conferences. Joe Barry does seem like he has some people skills. Heck, you don't end up in the NFL for as long as he has without your ability to perform or to develop relationships. But he doesn't seem to have the kind of people skills that lead him to understand what certain people need to succeed. And I think that's why some guys were held back under Barry, and some of those same guys are going to thrive under a Hafley, most notably Quay Walker. And so I've got for you on this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.